And hello everyone, thanks for coming out, welcome, welcome. My name's Tyler, and tonight I'm just going to be talking to you about a trip that I took to Sweden in the summer of 2017. This was basically the first big international solo trip, so it was pretty exciting, needless to say. But tonight I'm just going to share a couple of stories, some experiences, delve in a little bit to elements of culture shock that kind of stood out to me, and just general experiences from the trip. To start, when I first kind of decided on Sweden and I told friends and family about it, one of the big questions was why Sweden? It's not really on anyone's radar. When you think, trip to Europe, France is a big one, Spain, Italy, but Sweden is kind of one of those countries that I didn't really feel like it got a whole lot of attention. So, two big reasons why I chose Sweden. Something called allemansrätten, and this is actually not even exclusive to Sweden. This is actually a custom in much of Scandinavia, Norway, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, even parts of Germany and Spain. And what allemansrätten is the freedom to roam. What that essentially translates to us is camping, free to camp on public or private grounds. You don't need any kind of reservations or campsites. Wherever you find a spot that you see fit, that you want to camp for the night, it's all yours. Very appealing for sure. There are a couple of guidelines, but it's just very simple, self-explanatory things. Don't be an idiot about it. Be respectful. Don't burn anything down on reckless campfires. No hunting. As long as you're respectful, it's basically free reign. The other big reason why Sweden is, at the time, it was very politically and socially appealing. From a political standpoint, I'm not at all a political person, but I do know that Swedes are very progressive and forward-thinking, and that's kind of the mindset that I have myself. From a social point of view, some surveys that I had read previously, Swedes were among the happiest citizens in the world. They scored well on surveys. And so when you can kind of combine the political side and the social side of the country as a whole, it just seemed like a good choice, and especially with the Freedom to Roam Act. Quick tidbit about allemansrätten and why that was almost my selling point is that because you don't need to book any kind of campsite in advance, and you're free to camp on any suitable land, is that I chose the hammock approach. This was basically my home for 3.5 weeks. Just as long as I could find 2 trees to string this up, that was my campsite. And so living in a hammock was basically the way I did things, which saved a lot in accommodation costs as well. So I had about 3.5 weeks to put something together here. So because I wasn't constrained by any kind of reservations at hotels or campsites or motels, I was able to wing it for the most part and just kind of pick and choose where I wanted to go and when I wanted to go. So I really didn't have much of a plan laid out beforehand. And so the no-plan plan was three spots: Abisko, Gotland, and Stockholm. Now, you'll see on the map the red dots. I had to axe a few of them. I had a list of about 7 or 8 different cities amongst Sweden. But the consensus that I read about online beforehand was that if you have a finite amount of time to make a trip, you don't want to rush these cities. You don't want to spend 2 days in one town before you have to book it to the next. Because I feel like the more cities you try to knock off your itinerary, the less you see. It's almost ironic that the more you try to see, the less you actually do see. Whereas if you just choose 2 or 3 destinations over the course of 3 weeks, and you can spend a full week in each one, you can really explore the city a lot more than you would otherwise. So you can really chat amongst the locals more. You can find cool restaurants that you might have missed otherwise. So there were a number of cities that I did have to get rid of. Malmö, Göteborg, Umeå, Sundsvall, Kiruna was one of them. And so those are the red dots you see on the map there. Obviously the white highlights are the destinations that I had to settle on. Abisko being right up in the north there, right pretty much as far north in Sweden as you can get. Gotland being the island in the middle of the Baltic, and then of course Stockholm, the capital city. And so August 17th of 2017, we arrive in Stockholm at Arlanda Airport, just outside of Stockholm actually. And the trip actually got off to a very rocky start because the airline actually lost my luggage. I had, this was a bag that I traveled with here. I had everything in it, my hammock, my clothes, my sleeping bag, phone charger, everything like that. The only thing that I had on me when I got to Stockholm was what was in my pockets, which was just a wallet, phone, and passport, and then this. I kept a written journal each day. I just kind of marked down, what I experienced and whatnot. So this was basically all I had for the first 24 hours in Stockholm. It wasn't actually as big of a deal as it sounds because, yes, while I didn't have my hammock and all my supplies, I did book an Airbnb before I left Toronto in a town called Uppsala, which I'll show you in 2 seconds. So I actually did have a bed the first night. I had shelter, and I did get a phone charger overnight. So it was a bit of a bummer, a bit of a iffy start, but I was covered for at least the first night. My bag did arrive the day after, so it wasn't that long of a delay in any sense. And kind of a fun little side story about that first day, just kind of sitting in the Arlanda airport, wondering what to do, is I was chatting with a couple. Or actually, I think it was just a woman. Her husband was somewhere else, and so we were chatting a little bit. I was telling about where I was from, what I was doing, and the big one, where I was from. And of course, I reciprocated. I asked, "Where are you from?" to see if I recognized the town, see if I would maybe be stopping by her hometown. And she told me she was from Leksand, Sweden. Does Leksand actually ring a bell to anyone? No. It almost feels like a small world, because if you drive through Aurora on the Welcome to Aurora sign, it'll say twinned with Leksand, Sweden. So this woman was actually from a town that was twinned with basically where I'm from. So that was kind of a small world moment, which lightened the mood for sure, too. But my bag did arrive the next day, and overnight I stayed in, like I mentioned, a town called Uppsala. And this was actually the first element of culture shock that I think I experienced. And it's evident why. This was the main central train station, and not a car in sight. It was a sea of bicycles, but walking through a parking lot only of bikes was kind of a little bit of a, wow, this is very different. I'm not used to this in the slightest. And so once I did get my bag back and I was able to actually get things rolling, the first destination was Abisko, up north. And so it was a very long train ride from Stockholm all the way up north. It was 860 krona, which equates to about $137 Canadian. 18 hours of a journey. And once you kind of look at the math, it's like, that's not actually a terrible price for such a long ride. But one of the things that I did write in my journal at the time is, once we kind of got things going, is that, I think this will be the riskiest part of my trip. I'm heading away from most civilization. It's colder, I don't really know what it's like, but just part of the fun is not being comfortable. And so we arrive in Abisko, 200 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. And I assumed, being that far north, it would be a little bit colder. This was mid-August, but I still felt that latitude would have been, maybe single digits. But quite the opposite. It was actually 18 degrees and sunny when I arrived. Had to peel off a number of layers. I was expecting much colder temperatures. And even this train station here is actually the last station in Sweden. That train is the next stop for that one is in Norway. So that kind of also gives you a sense of how far north we're going here. And so my impressions of Abisko was this was the part of the trip that was more meant for hiking, for wilderness, for wild camping at its pinnacle. And the landscape almost tells you why. It was almost a mix between something like the Cape Breton Highlands in Nova Scotia paired with the Okanagan Valley in BC, if anyone's been to either of those places. Very, very huge hills, borderline mountains even, snow-capped on some of them, giant lakes, trees forever, and just true wilderness that you expect, away from any kind of civilization. The town itself was very basic, just a couple of apartment buildings, a gas station, a hostel, and a train station was about the extent of the town. And not to mention that the color scheme even too was just all red and white. So kind of interesting to see a town that's so similar colors on every single building that's there. So the more I stayed up in Abisko, the more I realized this is the greatest destination if you want to do some good hiking or snowshoeing in the winter time. There are paths along these cliffs here that ran alongside rivers, just completely surrounded by trees and mountains. The river at one point got funneled into this rock tunnel that spit out the other side with crazy white water, very violent rapids, and obviously you get a great view of it down from being up on the cliffs that run alongside it. So beautiful scenery. And this is a video clip here, I'll play in 2 seconds, just to give you a little bit of context, is that in Sweden, if the water is running, such as rivers, it's actually clean enough to drink. You don't need to filter it, boil it, it's as pure as it comes, essentially. And so you'll see at the end of this clip here, I took advantage of that. But the funny part about this river is I started out on this trail that was apparently supposed to lead to a series of little waterfalls. And of course I wanted to check that out. It seemed like a appealing spot to hang out for a little while. So a little bit into this trail, you actually have to cross this river. So as I was passing someone coming back the other way, he said, I don't know, I had to turn around because you're going to get wet if you want to keep going. So of course I kept going either way. But so to kind of give you a little bit of context, so this is actually part of the trail here, and you'll see in a second what I mean. If the water is flowing, it's clean enough to drink. So as we keep going down this trail, it started out great. It was smooth, it was packed dirt, it was easy going, but started getting a little bit of rain. It devolved into something a little bit sketchier. You can spend a lot more time looking down at your next foot placement instead of what's around you. Still very navigatable, but a lot of more jagged rocks. Still a trail, but once again, it devolved further into just basically a marsh. And by this point, of course, I had, soaked through my shoes. Both my socks were drenched. Everything up to the ankle was just soaked. It was raining again at this point. It was just a miserable, miserable time. I kicked off my shoes and just put on sandals because it was more comfortable than walking around in wet socks. But I never did make it to the waterfall. At this point, this was kind of the, turnaround Tyler. This isn't gonna become any better. Switch out the shoes with some sandals. Walk back miserable in mud, in swamp. And I was having a rotten time until I got back to my favorite river to kick around, wade in, kick the waves, and just feel like a 4-year-old again. Also up in Nabisco, there was Kungsleden. And what this is a 400-kilometer trail, much like the Bruce Trail here. It's a very well-known, very famous trail system that runs through basically much of northern Sweden. Great for, everyone knows it. Everyone goes there for, week-long hikes, treks, snowshoeing, anything like that. So, of course, I had to see the Kungsleden for myself, and much better. This was the view from a part of it. Obviously, the trail on the left being much more manageable, drier. The scenery was just the same, walking alongside these violent, wild rivers. Much better day. But by this point, the weather still wasn't looking like it was going to cooperate. It was decent, it was overcast, it wasn't raining, which was nice, but at the same time, I was still ready to head south and keep going with the next part of the trip. And so I got on the train, and part of what I wrote down too was I was just thinking about my miserable hike from yesterday, laughing about it now, and I thought of the best way to summarize it is that I went hiking alone in the Arctic in sandals. So, I forgot to mention as well is that the trip up to Abisko was, I didn't get a sleeper car. It was just a flat rate for just a seat, no bed, even though it was an 18-hour ride. It was regrettable, and so I did spring for the extra $40 on the way back to actually lie down and sleep instead of, head down on the flip-down table on the seat in front of you. So much better decision, and I'm for $40, it's definitely well worth it. And so we get to, after the trip back south, we get to a town called Nynäshamn. This was where the ferry comes along to take you to Gotland, which of course is my next destination. But my thoughts about Nynäshamn, even though I was really only there for an afternoon, it did remind me a lot of a place like Rustico on PEI or Lunenburg in Nova Scotia. You'll also probably hear me reference the East Coast a lot in other towns, but it does make sense. But being right on the Baltic, it was very much a hermit town, a very seaside kind of town, very fishing heavy. Also very hilly. It was almost like San Francisco's little brother in a way. Most of my day here was actually just waiting for the ferry. I had two options at this point. I could either pay, I think, $45 for a 3:30 crossing to Gotland, or wait until 9 p.m. and pay $15. Being cheap, I went with $15 and just hung out in Nynäshamn for the rest of the day. So most of the day was actually just this, waiting around in the ferry terminal, playing on my phone. I did do a little bit of a foot tour of the town beforehand. And actually while I was doing that, I stopped at this little shack type of thing. It was along the water. There was like a boardwalk with little artisan shops selling crafts and handmade gifts, cafes, typical fishing village type of spots like that. And being right on the water, I got a fish and chip set at this place, thinking that you would get a giant piece of cod that big with huge, thick cut fries and But what it actually was, you know those little trapezoidal fish sticks about that long you get at the frozen food section at Zayas? It was 2 of those little guys and a handful of shoestring fries, and just not at all what you would expect from such a fishing-heavy town like Nynäshamn. So when the ferry actually did come, it was much bigger than I thought it was going to be. I thought maybe something like, going to the Toronto Islands, just, something decent size. You could put a couple of cars on, a bunch of people. But it was actually way bigger than I thought it was going to be, something more like a cruise ship, it seemed. Yeah, it took the 9 o'clock across to Gotland. Now, Gotland being a pretty small island in the Baltic, you can basically drive north to south in maybe an hour. It's not huge, but I still had 3 big destinations that I had my eye on beforehand. There was Visby, there was Forosund, and then there was Djurgården. And so starting in Visby, this was absolutely the highlight that basically I think solidified everything that I thought about Sweden. This picture almost tells you everything that you need to know. It was very medieval, very, old European, church ruins like that. It was surrounded by this, at points, 7 meter, I believe, high wall that surrounded the entire city. Of course, all the roofs were all the old orange iron roofs on all the buildings, all the churches. It just had very genuine old European feel to it, including the streets. All cobblestone. All the buildings were different pastels of oranges, pinks. Even all the doorways covered in flower boxes, planters, and very, very quaint and very cute little town to walk around. And no cars really whatsoever. I think I saw maybe 2 cars the entire time driving on the streets, but it was basically just pedestrians and bicycles for the most part within the town itself. As I mentioned, a lot of church ruins were more or less the focal point of Visby. Each one, there were about 6 or 7 throughout the interior of the wall. And each one dates back to the 13th century, 1258, 1267 were some of the dates on some of these. And each one being different from the previous. Some more with a Gothic style, some without roofs, some with roofs. But what was neat about all these ruins as well is that, to me, it seemed like a tourist attraction. In that, this is, if you go to Visby, everyone who goes to Visby has to go to these ruins. And so I kind of assumed that maybe there would be some kind of gate or admission or tour set up for this type of thing. But each one of these ruins was actually completely open, completely accessible, no entry fee. You were able to just walk in like it was a public park. Explore it at your own pace, and that kind of struck me as being so open, so accessible. So it's nice to see that the Swedes are letting everyone enjoy this type of thing without expecting money from it. And so the last in Visby, this was my campsite for the first night in Visby. Nice sunset out on the Baltic, and of course I had written, by far the best day of the trip so far. Super happy right now. This is the kind of day I want for the rest of my time here. Amazing day, couldn't be happier. And that's what it was. It was bright and sunny all day, beautiful temperatures, and it just made for the perfect day to explore this town that was the focal point, more or less, of the trip in general. And so from Visby, we go to Forosund. This was kind of not really a write-off day. I didn't really expect much. It was I didn't really read about any kind of big attractions or anything. It was just almost a regular town. this was essentially the big landmark, a giant stone windmill. I'm not sure how old it is, to be honest. I did a lap of it to see if there was some kind of plaque or imprint saying the year that it was built, but no dice. But nonetheless, nice little spot to hang out for a little while. Up near Fort Sun, there's another separate island called Fort. And the thing with this island, with Fort, is that I had heard about something called rocks, R-A-U-K-S. And what these are these giant stone pillars, naturally made by wind and water erosion. Different shapes, different sizes, different angles, just like giant stalagmites coming off the beach, which sounded interesting to me. So I had heard that Fort had a lot of these. So I took this ferry across. It was, once again, a free ferry, and you just walk right on. There's no lineup, there's no tickets. It's only about a 5-minute sailing between Fort Sun and Fort. But once I got off on the other side, I realized that there's no actual transportation there. There's no buses, there's no taxis, there's no bike rental. Basically, the only way to get around is if you already have a bike yourself or a car, then you're able to walk to travel the island. But having none of those, I was more or less just stuck. Couldn't really go anywhere. The closest real place, civilization-wise, from the dock was about a 2-hour walk one way. And so once I discovered that, I just kind of went right back on the next ferry and went right back to Fort Sun. And just called that trip a wash. Luckily, there was two ferries kind of running opposite one another, so the wait was really 10 minutes, if that. So no wasted time, no wasted money, no big deal. But the adventure of Fort, 20 minutes. Also in Fort Sun, once I got back, was I had to do another typical Swedish custom, is what they call fika. And fika is basically almost like a second lunch break. 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, just about every Swede will take another break from work or from whatever it is they're doing, grab a cup of coffee and a muffin, and just kind of lounge for 45 minutes to an hour. Chat with friends if they're with people or just by themselves, and just kind of wind down with a coffee called fika in Sweden. Another little adventure that I had in Fort Sun was I wanted to find something more to do. So the day before back in Visby, my legs were dead tired from both the weight of the backpack, from walking around the town for 8 or 9 hours. And so I was feeling it the next day here in Fort Sun. And so I wrote down also, stupidly went for a bit of a walk trying to find a beach, no dice, and I took a nap at 2 and woke up at 5. And so that night, since I didn't sleep in the afternoon, I wasn't tired enough to fall asleep at night. So after aching legs and being wired at 4 a.m., it wasn't really much of a sleep in Fort Sun that night. And so because there's no direct bus line from Fort Sun to Djurgården, which is where I wanted to go next, is I actually had to go back to Visby and then grab another bus from Visby to Djurgården. And while I was back in Visby waiting for to switch buses, that's when I met Anna from California. And the reason that I wanted to tell you about Anna is because as I was buying my second bus ticket to go to Djurgården at the ticket counter, this girl over by the window said, when we went done, she said, "I heard you speaking English to the guy getting a ticket. Like, where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Canada." And she said, "Oh, cool, California." So because we had about 45 minutes or so to wait around for our respective buses, we just kind of hung out in the bus station and talked for a little while. But the thing with Anna is that the more we talked, she told me all about how she knew all kinds of history about Egyptian tribes and pharaohs and descendants of Mali villages, and just the most obscure type of history that you wouldn't really focus too much on here. But after she kind of gave me a couple of lessons on that, she says, "So you said you're from Canada, so I need you to explain something for me. How does bagged milk work?" She knew all about the plastic pitchers. She said, like, do you cut the top off and then pour the milk in the pitcher, and then from the pitcher do you have coffee, or what do you do with bagged milk? And of course I explained the whole, put the bag in the pitcher, snip the corner, and that's your thing. But it was hilarious to think that someone who was so well versed in Egyptian cultures and Southeast Asian tribes was completely baffled by bagged milk. So I had to tell that story as well. And so from Visby, we parted ways, and I went off to Yugorn. And I mentioned that I might reference a couple of East Coast towns, and Yugorn is no exception to that. Is that it reminded me a lot of like a small Cavendish, actually, on PEI. The town itself, like you can see, is also very European, both in terms of architecture and color schemes and all the rest of it. But I also found those rocks completely by chance that I missed out on back on Foreux. These are the rocks that I was mentioning, giant stone pillars coming up from off the beach. So completely by fluke. I'm kind of glad that I chose Yugorn to explore for the day. But what kind of stood out for me for Yugorn was all kinds of different styles of beach. Kind of in the top here, it's like rock boulders and giant stones make up that part of the beach. Whereas just a couple of meters away, you get these are actually kind of cool. The way the waves carve out the rocks there. Sitting in there, you could find a spot that's almost like a hot tub seat that you just kind of sink into. It's perfectly contoured. You sometimes even get an armrest that's made for you. But all kinds of different styles of beaches around Yugorn, including, this is why I said it's a lot like Cavendish, is that white sand beaches that just turns into the sea that just goes off as far as you can see right to the horizon, and of course backed by reeds and grass, a lot like Cavendish Beach on PEI, if anyone's ever been there too. And so it was a little bit of a bummer, but because this beach in particular was one of the nicer ones, but just jellyfish everywhere. You couldn't really do that much swimming there. But nonetheless, walking around outside of town on the outskirts, this was actually one of my favorite parts about Yugorn, is once you get outside the main part of the town, you get to these old farms that just kind of have that old Midwestern kind of farm feel to them, with the small stone fences and the small compact kind of farmhouses. It was pretty much like a Wyoming farm without the horses in a way. And so after kind of doing a whole tour and getting to know Yugorn, had another great day, or days actually there, and I had to make note of it. Another great day, sunny all day. Went for a walk through a new part of town, which was those red houses with the stone fences. All down dirt roads. No one's making any noise. Very peaceful, very serene. Now with Yugorn though, the only kind of drawback was that bus service there was very limited. So I actually had to wait for a couple of days until what would have been a Monday for the next bus back to Visby. But all in all, the time in Yukon was, very relaxing, beachy, peaceful, sunny day, and more of these would be great. And so from Yukon, I went back to Visby for one more tour. I'm glad I did. I had two options at this point. One, I could have taken, once again, an early ferry back to the mainland, back to Nynäshamn, for $45, $50, or taken a morning ferry early in the morning the next day for a third of the price. And so I'm kind of glad it worked out that way, because I was able to then use that full day to explore Visby once again, to go down new streets, see new stores, do a whole lap of the perimeter wall. And a little bit of a side story while we're in Visby is language barrier. This is where I kind of discovered the more or less where the language would have a factor. Is that there was this cafe downtown that that I got lunch at, and every interaction that I've had with a Swede until this point, I've started the conversation in Swedish, essentially just saying, "Do you speak English?" The year or so before I went here, I had been teaching myself Swedish kind of off and on, and I learned the basics. I kind of knew a decent amount of vocabulary, so I was able to start each interaction with, "Pratar du svenska? Do you speak engelska? Do you speak English?" And 99% of the time, I would get a yes, I do. And so we would then continue the exchange in English. But this one cafe that I went to in Visby, I said, "Pratar du engelska?" Yes, I do. Okay, great. Could I get, a sandwich with ham, cheese, and a cup of coffee, or whatever it is I got? And she said, "Yeah, you can, for sure, but you started speaking to me in Swedish, so I already know you know some Swedish. So let's try, I want you to then reorder, but in Swedish." And that was actually the first time that someone called me out on it. It makes perfect sense. You would think that if someone comes up to you and speaks your native tongue, that they would at least know enough to get by. But then to immediately revert to English was like, okay, hold on, no, I know you know this language, try again. It was no big deal. I managed to get through it. It was basic vocabulary, but it did actually kind of put what I had learned into an actual situation, to interact with a Swede with a language that I had been learning. So in a way, it essentially paid off to a degree in Visby. I'm also glad I spent another day in Visby, because I found this place, having the sweet tooth that I do, just endless amounts of free-for-all candy, and this is actually only about half of it. There's an entire other wall on the other side of the store with an equal amount. Just grab a bag and a scoop. It's all sold by weight, so you can go absolutely nuts with all kinds of candy there. And kind of along the same lines as food is, in terms of difference in food between here and Sweden, not a huge difference. But I did try a couple of typical Swedish or Swedish-only foods that you can't get anywhere else. On the train up to Abisko, I had tried a reindeer meat wrap. On Gotland, actually the last day in Visby right here, they had a brewery that Gotland has their own brewery, so I tried some Visby beer. Okay, Dan, this one's for you. I got this actually quite a long time ago, like a few days ago, but I have with me the what's it called again? Gotland's Videography. It's actually my last day on Gotland, so what better way to celebrate with Gotland's Videography? I can never pronounce it right. Videography. It's actually a really good beer. I'm not a huge beer drinker, as you know, but I will enjoy this one definitely tonight on the beach in Uganda. But I think the big one in terms of food was something called salt lakritz, and this is salty licorice. Salt lakritz, salty licorice, right from Sweden. Here on Gotland, just outside Visby. These are kind of known to be either you love them or you hate them. So, see if there's an aftertaste. Not really, it's just how it tastes right out of the bag is how it stays. And it's different. I don't mind them. They're definitely a lot saltier than North American licorice, but pretty good. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's black licorice, but with about 1,500 times more salt. That's an exaggeration, but it's different for sure. You try some and it's like, oh, that's new. But salt lakritz is actually, not a terrible kind of snack if you ever find yourself in Sweden to give that a go. So this would have been my last day on Gotland and in Visby, and of course I had beautiful weather once again, crystal clear all day, absolutely gorgeous, amazing last day on Gotland, weather-wise and exploration-wise. And what I really liked about my campsite that I had set up here, and this is an example of Allemansrätten, I was able to just put my hammock up at the base of the wall outside Visby, and no one bothers you, no one asks you to move, just very free kind of country. But why I really like this site, I think encompassed my last night there perfectly. I had perfect blue skies right up on the top. I had the green grass, but the best part is, I think, is the way the sunset was hitting the wall right in the middle. Just gave the wall that orange glow, and just seeing all these vibrant colors, at the base of the oldest settlement in southern Sweden was just, to me, a perfect cap to the Gotland part of the trip. And so we end in Stockholm. Now, with Stockholm, I'm not a huge city kind of person. I don't like crowds. I hate how it takes forever to get anywhere. Stockholm was absolutely the exception. Beautiful city all around. But being the biggest city and having public transportation and all the rest of it, I opted to get a transit card, essentially like a metro pass, if that's what it's still called. Basically, just it was about $50. It gives you unlimited access for a whole week to subways, buses, streetcars, commuter trains. And since this was the last stop, that I wouldn't need to spend any more money on transportation, I opted to get this transit card. And as soon as I got on I bought it, and as soon as I got to the subway station, this was the map of the subway system in Stockholm. And while it looks like a lot, it's actually not too difficult to manage. Yes, there's a lot more lines than the TTC. There's 10 times more stations. But once you have a look at the map and you kind of know, green line, red line, and which direction they typically go, and it was laid out very, very well. And despite how confusing it looks, absolutely no issues getting around on the Stockholm subway system. And speaking of subways, subway stops, each station was completely unique in its own way. This was T-Centralen, essentially Stockholm's Union Station, where all the lines kind of meet, where the main hub of the subway and the transit system as a whole. And this one in particular was kind of a museum type of feel with totem poles and statues and carvings and all the rest of it. Whereas you go a couple of stops down the line and you get these Atari-style 8-bit video game kind of motif. And with each station in Stockholm, each station has its own theme and its own motif and different theme, essentially. And so that was kind of a neat part about Stockholm too. So within Stockholm, I had a couple of different neighborhoods that I wanted to have a look at. The first being Gamla stan. This is Old Town. And this is, you could almost call it like Vieux Quebec, like Old Quebec or Old Montreal. All 1800s architecture. Again, cobblestone streets, and all lined with I guess high-end restaurants. Shops, local shops, bars, and also home to a number of museums. This, in particular, the Medieval Museum, was actually one of my favorites because it included the original Stockholm city wall, but considering that dates back to 1252, it's still impressive that they have that on display. You'll see more as we get through Stockholm that museums there are free. It doesn't seem like there's the ferry between Fårösund and Fårö was free. The Medieval Museum was free. Camping is free. So this was actually fun to walk around. They had artifacts of everything to do with medieval Sweden: armor, weapons, tools, way of life. And this was actually one of the more interesting parts of it, in my opinion, is that this here is actually the first known instance of having Stockholm in writing. Right on the bottom there is apparently the first time that it's ever been written down. I don't know what year this was, but nonetheless. Also within Gamla stan, the Royal Palace, home of the King of Sweden, where they also have the changing of the guard ceremony. So this video that I'll play here is bits and pieces of different changing of the guards that I went to. I went to, I think, 2 or 3 of them. So different angles, but the first time, what I liked about the first one is that they had like a brass band come in and play fanfare on horseback. They had a giant black horse with 2 timpanis, and the guy's like banging timpanis on horseback. And you'll kind of hear and see elements of the changing of the guards here. On top of the Royal Palace and the Medieval Museum, also had a chance to look at the Livrustkammaren. This is the Royal Armory, where they had past and present pieces of equipment, things like old stagecoaches going back to the 1800s that Swedish royalty would ride around in, things like ceremonial suits of armor, gowns, robes, costumes, anything to do with royalty was in this was in Livrustkammaren, and once again free to get into. Another really cool neighborhood of Stockholm that I really liked was Djurgården. And this could be compared to something like Central Park in New York. It was a very green space, lots of walking and biking trails through parkland, forests and ponds with fountains in the middle of them, canals with boats going down them, lots of great spots for things like game of soccer or walking, bike riding, just a giant, essentially, park that's right in the middle of the city, but despite that, still very green. And elements of Djurgården was the amusement park there, Gröna Lund. Kind of like a scaled-down version of Wonderland. A couple of roller coasters, a couple of drop towers. Kind of neat to even have a look at from this angle, from the other side of the water, looking into Djurgården. Another museum in Stockholm was the Ship's Museum. This one in particular is the Sankt Erik. This is actually Sweden's first icebreaker ship that you were able to walk on, explore at your own pace, go up to the bridge, the decks, the galleys. They had a little museum on the lower decks, and essentially kind of do a self-guided tour of a couple of different ships, such as the icebreaker. They had a lighthouse ship from 1942, I believe, and that lighthouse ship was actually very compact. Not a lot of room to walk around in, but neat to look through nonetheless. And of course, they had the one museum that Sweden is obligated to have, the ABBA Museum. Even if you're not a huge fan of ABBA, this was apparently, it's apparently one of the more well put together museums. I didn't actually spring for this one. I think I was on a little bit of I wanted to do a lot more in and around Stockholm. But I had plans to come back, but never actually did make it back. But ABBA Museum, definitely worthwhile checking out if you find yourself in Stockholm. And then you can tell me all about it. Not necessarily in Djurgården, but outside a little bit was the Stockholm City Library, which it doesn't really sound like a type of spot that you would go to on vacation, but the way that it was built wasn't really like a typical library. It was more of a rotunda with 3 different levels, with all the books kind of on the outsides. Kind of more of an open concept type of library. So up until this point, I had been pretty much on my own. I didn't really socialize that much. I chatted with that one cafe owner in Visby who called me out on the Swedish. Her and I were chatting a little bit, but nothing too in depth. Anna, but this was actually the first kind of social night that I had. I found a group that holds board game nights. It was kind of nice to break away from the whole lone wolf thing I was doing and just kind of hang out with the locals and play board games. And the one guy on the left, kind of behind me, with black hat and blue shirt, as well as the guy with the glasses on the far right, they actually designed this game that we're playing here. So it was kind of an interesting experience. Is that the first time that I actually kind of had more of a social life was giving a board game the very first test drive with the designers and a couple of locals. So it was a nice night to break away from the norm there too. And then after I kind of got a sense of Djurgården, once again had great weather. It's been unreal, probably the best day of the trip so far. I've been in the best mood since the library. The weather has been perfect all day, and the things I've seen and done, incredible day. Absolutely phenomenal day. Loved everything about it. And this was essentially my mindset for the vast majority of the trip, is that the weather was very cooperative 99% of the time, and just all kinds of different experiences and different places, people. And then the last neighborhood that I had to have a look at was Södermalm. And this, I think, would have been kind of like the Queen West. Very kind of trendy, hipstery kind of neighborhood where everyone kind of dresses the way they want to. No one really bats an eye if you're dressed like a hobo or a goth. It's super open-minded and just really chill and laid back. And even the other stores too. You got vintage stores, record shops, kind of those hip, young kind of restaurants and cafes. And while I was exploring Södermalm, I found this record store that I went in, it was really underground in kind of two ways. Literally a basement space of a bigger complex. But the records that they had in there were things that you would never find in any kind of, I don't know if it still exists, but like HMV or Sunrise or, typical stores with, Beatles, Van Halen. This record store had things like, Euro trance, dubstep, jazz fusion with, the craziest combination of genres and styles. But what struck me most about it was the atmosphere of it. Very dim lighting, kind of really sketchy. You're not too sure if this is the right kind of spot that you want to hang out in. And but the more time I spent down there, I actually kind of wrote in my journal about it. As soon as I went in and saw that space, I was convinced that at least one person in there was involved in some kind of drug ring. First impression was super sketchy, but the more time I spent down there, I realized just a couple of misfits who probably like to light up, put on some 80s remixed Brazilian bongo and trumpet records, and eat cheesies. And that's essentially what it was. Everyone was just in their own headspace, not bothering anyone else, just kind of in their own world. They had this beat-up couch on one wall where you could, a couple of stations set up where you can put on a record and kind of sample it. Based on the lighting and the way that it was downstairs in this kind of dirty, grungy kind of space, didn't strike me as a very safe kind of spot. But once I left this record store, and I kind of got a sense of who the clientele is here, the more I actually missed it, and I did revisit it a couple of days later. But this record store was just definitely one of the highlights of my little tours of Södermalm. And so, kind of to wrap things up a little bit, September 4th, it was 3 weeks at this point. It was my last day. Awesome country, rain all day and cold. I didn't plan on doing anything that day, and that's pretty much how it played out, partly because of the rain, partly because that's what I wanted. 3 weeks, I think, was just a perfect amount of time to do this. I don't feel like I rushed anything. I saw everything I wanted to within 5 or 6 days. I didn't feel like I had to switch up my itinerary on the go too much, because the amount of time that it took to really get a sense of each one of these places seemed to be just the right amount of time, and so I think it worked out really well. And so I took a brief stopover in Reykjavik on the way home, and I go home tomorrow. This trip is unofficially over 3.5 weeks that I don't think I'll ever forget. New experiences, new people, new places, hiking in the Arctic, swimming in the Baltic, living in a hammock. I'm very happy. No catastrophes. There was no declined credit cards. There was no run-ins with people, no damage. Basically flawless, and it's one of the things that if you don't do, you're going to regret. I think the only real flaw in the entire time was just the fact that I didn't have a bag on that first day, which really wasn't even that big of a deal. Rain wasn't an issue. I had a good rain fly for the hammock. Weather otherwise was super cooperative, and so on. The next day, as we say in the film industry, cut strike, that's a wrap back in Toronto. And so I think with that, that is a wrap for this one. If anyone's got any questions that I might not touch on, or if anyone wants any more details on anything, we can open this up to a little bit of a Q&A. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming out. Thanks for listening. And thank you so much.
When you were traveling, did you carry your knapsack everywhere, or did you kind of plop it down and create a spot and then wander?
Very good question, actually, yes. Up until Visby, I did walk around with a pack the whole time. But once I got to Visby, and once I kind of felt the weight of it after, however many days or weeks that would have been, I actually did change it up a little, is that I set up home base in the morning wherever I was planning on staying that night. And this was a little bit of a risky move, but I did leave my backpack behind with my hammock while I went and explored the town for the afternoon before coming back in the evening. The reason that I felt safe in doing that is two reasons. Number one is that I always chose a spot kind of out in the middle of, away from paths, away from cities. Even in Stockholm, being in the middle of the city, you still could find a patch of woods away from buildings that no one really walks to. And so yes, for a couple of days, especially on Gotland, I did leave my pack behind for the day.
And in Stockholm, you did the same thing?
Stockholm, I believe so. I'm trying to remember. I might have once or twice. For the most part, I did have it with me. I think it was really just a couple of those last days on Gotland. But yeah, I think in Stockholm, I basically had it with me more because I was getting around by subways and buses rather than walking around with the weight of it. So.
Did you encounter any wildlife?
Not really face-to-face encounters, but I did see a moose from the train on the way to Abisko. That's about the extent of it. But I did encounter something that easily could have been a little bit a dicey situation, is that in Abisko, I stumbled across this stack of bones, like a skeleton essentially. I don't know what it used to be, but definitely something. A carnivore definitely was living around there somewhere, but I never ran into any bears or wolves or anything like that.
So never felt unsafe during the whole trip, other than in the record store?
Not entirely, because I think the spot that I guess I would have felt the most unsafe would have been in Abisko, just being kind of out in bear country, out in moose country. But even then wasn't a huge deal because I stuck to the trails that people were walking on all the time, and my campsites were actually back in within the town, pretty much right next to the rail station. If I had been camping out in the middle of a forest with nothing around for miles, then yeah, I would have been a little bit uneasy about that because I didn't have any bear spray or knives or anything like that. But yeah, no, pretty much I didn't really feel uneasy about even in bear country up there. Oh, well,
What was your budget for the whole trip?
budget was, I spent about $2,600 on the entire thing, including the flight. I think the reason why it kind of came out so inexpensive is that I didn't have to pay for accommodations. But between the flight, the food, I did stay in a couple of hostels. I think there were a total of, actually just two hostels I stayed in. One in Abisko, one in Stockholm. But because every other day besides those was free camping, that's at least probably at least $1,000 for sure that I didn't have to really spend on accommodations. So yeah, $2,600 for flight, food, transportation. That's about it.